Welcome to the Culture Lab. I'm your host, Aga Bayer. This podcast helps you turn your company culture into rocket fuel for meaningful growth. It explores how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. It looks at how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing.
So for me, culture is the way we do things around here when no one is looking. And that's very important, the second part, the no one is looking part, because I think you cannot game a culture, you cannot have a culture because you think it's something nice to have and looks good on your wall, but rather you have to do it because you believe in it. So when you change the way you act because you believe in it, and there's no advantage to be gained there, and no one's looking and measuring you on that, you have a true culture. And that really is the advantage that you can have within your business.
Hello, and welcome to episode 103 of the Culture Lab podcast. This episode is brought to you by CultureBrained, a one-of-a-kind global community for leaders and culture champions who want to learn new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures at scale in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. The CultureBrained community is where we come together to answer some pretty darn hard, ungoogleable questions about culture. And our members get to participate in things like weekly huddles, masterclasses, flash mastermind groups, and talks from world-class experts on culture. And you know many of these experts from this podcast. But most importantly, we facilitate deep peer-to-peer connections. Because making work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, it's definitely not a task for a single person. It requires tapping into the collective wisdom of bold, kind, and curious culture leaders who are on a mission to redefine and, frankly, decrapify work. So, if this sounds like something you'd like to be a part of, check it out at tiny.1/CultureBrained. And don't worry, you don't have to write it down. There is a link in the show notes. Today is a very special episode because for the first time in the history of this show, we have a member of the CultureBrained community as a guest. His name is Strode, and not only is he the Global Group Director of Culture and Strategy at Banco Santander, which is a Spanish multinational financial services firm, Dan is also the author of a recently published book called The Culture Advantage: Empowering Your People to Drive Innovation. Like so many of the CultureBrained community members, Dan believes that the way forward for any business is building a company with the people at its heart. And in this interview, we talk about how, by harnessing your people's power through a corporate culture of innovation, you can unlock business opportunities that your competition won't have access to. And here are some of the topics that we unpack in this interview. Why psychological safety and growth mindset are such a must when it comes to innovation, and what are the best practices for creating psychological safety and fostering growth mindset. We chat about the value of diversity, experimentation, and learning from our failures. And we also talk about the magic of setting hard goals and having constraints, because constraints are really important, and you'll find out why in this interview. And finally, we touch upon a topic that I know is close to everyone's hearts now and everyone is experiencing these days. A really high level of anxiety people feel. And we talk about what can leaders do to help their team members navigate through really tough times. So with no further ado, here is my conversation with Dan Strode.
Hi, I'm Dan Strode. I'm quite a unique blend, I would say. I'm part practitioner, part teacher, and part author as well when it comes to culture. In terms of practitioner, I'm head of strategy and culture for Grupo Santander, based in Spain. In terms of teaching, I teach on cultures of innovation and how to improve culture across the globe in various universities. And in terms of writing and being an author, I just released The Culture Advantage, which is my first book.
Congratulations on that, by the way. Culture Advantage, empowering your people to drive innovation. I'm super keen to jump in and talk about your book and the ideas that you share in the book. But also, it would be really a pity not to dive into all the roles that you play and what you are learning through that, because it's actually quite rare for me on the show to have someone who is simultaneously a thought leader in the space of culture, a teacher, and a practitioner. I really can't wait to pick your brain. But before we go there, there's one question that I ask all our guests at the very beginning of an interview. And the question is about the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person. How did you grow up and what imprint had it left on you?
Yeah, so I grew up in the United Kingdom, just outside of London, into a family. I was the oldest child of 3 boys. And really, I would say I owe an awful lot to my parents, both of them. So my mother was working and looking after 3 boys. I can't imagine a household with 3 boys, honestly, how much stress and effort that requires to manage. And she was a massive, massive influence on my life, giving me the love and the care and the attention that I needed to help me grow. And my father, at the same time, was working away, working really hard, working globally. He started his own business, and that got me really interested in the topic of business and business management in general. So that was my early life and my childhood, I would say, quite regular, quite normal in the United Kingdom. And then for the last 5 or 6 years, I've moved country and I'm actually living in Madrid in Spain. And that would be my perhaps even bigger cultural reflection or cultural journey that I've been on, living in another country, experiencing what that's like, adopting a new language, adopting new customs and practices, and really shaping my outlook and seeing that there's another world outside of the UK.
Yeah, it's always fascinating, isn't it? I mean, I've been an expat myself for more than 30 years. And I think people who have never left their country to live and work somewhere else don't entirely realize that it really completely shifts the way you perceive norms and rituals and culture, because you suddenly realize, A, that you have a culture, and B, that other people don't share your culture and your way of thinking and being and doing things. And it's so eye-opening. So really quick question for a person who was brought up in the UK. What was the biggest culture shock for you moving into Spain?
Well, it's interesting because they don't tend to share my personal love of cups of tea. So it's very difficult for them to prepare a good cup of tea. And the Queen and the royal family perhaps is not so loved here in Spain as it is in the UK. But I think in terms of, real cultural differences in the day-to-day, the lifestyle in Spain is much more open, honest and accessible. And that's a really big change. Of course, they have more sunlight hours during the summer. So people are more social in the evenings. They spend time outside with one another late until the night. And of course, that's not so common in the UK. So I think if I said one thing, I would say the social experience is much different.
Same here, actually, because I'm currently based in Greece, and I think Greece and Spain are quite similar in that aspect. And so it's so fun to explore how people engage differently in social situations and the way you will communicate certain messages and so on and so forth. So I totally resonate with that. So let me circle back to how we opened this conversation. And that was basically your multiple roles, the fact that you've written a book on culture called Culture Advantage. So I guess that's probably the best place for us to start this conversation about culture. What is a culture advantage? How do you define it?
So for me, culture is the way we do things around here when no one is looking. And that's very important, the second part, the no one is looking part, because I think you cannot game a culture, you cannot have a culture because you think it's something nice to have and looks good on your wall, but rather you have to do it because you believe in it. So when you change the way you act because you believe in it, and there's no advantage to be gained there, and no one's looking and measuring you on that, you have a true culture. And that really is the advantage that you can have within your business, because everybody can copy a strategy or invent a new strategy, but they can't necessarily replicate a culture like for like. And that's why I call it the culture advantage, because I believe it really can give you a business advantage.
Absolutely. Even in the subtitle of your book, where you talk about how culture can help organizations drive innovation, it's really clear that indeed it is a huge advantage, because obviously we live in a world where you either innovate or perish. And so I wonder whether you would like to speak to that need to innovate first, because your book looks really closely at how culture can support innovation in organizations. And I'm sure that for all of our listeners, who most of them are culture practitioners trying to shape culture in their own companies, they're very well aware of that as well. So why is innovation so important, I guess, these days, even more so than ever? And what role does culture play in that?
Of course, culture, as you say, it could be implemented well in any company to do nearly anything. So it could be innovation, it could be any number of different things. But I focused on innovation because there's a real pressing need for companies to innovate and to change and to adapt. There's a shocking statistic. If you look at the S&P 500, so the top 500 American companies today, and you look historically at the lifespan of those companies, you see that they used to live on average about 60 years, and now they live less than 20 on average. And when you extrapolate those numbers and that lifespan, what you see is that 5 years in the future, in 2027, 75% of those companies in that index today will not be in that index in the future. So there'll be much change, they'll be out of business or smaller, but they will not be there. And that's shocking, because if you name 10 of the biggest companies you can think of in the world, and then you say 7 or 8 of them won't be here in 5 years' time, or will be completely changed for the worse, for being smaller, that's really, really proves to me we need to innovate and we need to change. And everybody in the business and academic world looks at those case studies of companies like Kodak and Blockbuster and Nokia, who all had wonderful market shares and went by the wayside. And when you trace and you research what was the reason for that failure in those businesses, you find that it was in part down to the culture that they had and the fact that they didn't have those cultures of innovation. So I found it really important and a pressing topic to really share what are the best companies in the world doing when it comes to cultures of innovation. And it was interesting to me because 8 very clear patterns became apparent.
That makes total sense, of course. And yet, I think what we all experience is that there is a gap between acknowledging that innovation is more important than ever and being successful in generating innovation within your team, within your organization. Part of the conversations that I have with a lot of leaders in companies that try to innovate is frustration. The frustration, what they say is their frustration around the fact that although they've tried everything, and I'm doing air quotes now, it's not working and they're not getting the results that they want. Why do you think this happens? First of all, is this your experience as well? And if yes, what stands in the way?
It is definitely my experience. Many companies become frustrated at their innovation efforts. They become frustrated that they haven't yielded the results that they want. And it is true that typically the culture is the thing that's blocking them from being successful. For example, many companies think that just by having lots of resources, lots of people, lots of money, lots of time, they can innovate and they're going to be the most successful company at innovation. And we know that that's not true. So if you think about Nokia, they were outspending Apple and Samsung and all the other competitors by a factor of 10. And they thought that because they were spending so much money, they would be more innovative. And of course, that didn't happen. And they're not the only company. So it's normal to find these kind of frictions within companies. But when you scratch the surface and you say, what's really going on here? What you find is sometimes those extra resources that they have, and this is just an example, are actually stopping them from being innovative. And it would be better not to have those, and it would be better to focus on a culture.
Yeah. It's fascinating, isn't it? Because actually you discover that scrappiness and having constraints to overcome can generate and help innovation. And this, I guess, is the competitive advantage of smaller companies that don't have these resources. And that's why it's one of the reasons why it's so hard to innovate for companies that theoretically they can afford anything and they do spend a lot of money on innovation and yet don't get the same results. And so, as you say, this is where culture is going to play a major role. And I think this is probably also where culture plays a major role as an obstacle to innovation. Let's start with the obstacles, maybe. What are the major obstacles in cultures that you've experienced yourself that prevent organizations or teams from being truly innovative?
I think one of the main things that people trip themselves up with is that they come to work with a fixed mindset. And I suppose you know very well the research of Dr. Carol Dweck, who articulated the difference between companies and individuals who have a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And she articulated that people who had a growth mindset were people who were more likely to want to contribute. They were more likely to accept that their skills could be improved over time, that feedback helps them to grow, that there's always room for improvement. People with a fixed mindset didn't take feedback well. They were not open to constructive criticism. They believed that they were either good at something or bad at something. And if nothing was broken, there was no need to improve or to change things. And I see that a lot within companies. I see that within the highest performing companies, that they're with a growth mindset. And perhaps the companies that are struggling the most believe in this fixed mindset and display those traits. And it's very interesting to me because research has been done that proves that when you have that growth mindset in your company, you actually have nearly 50% more innovation, 65% more risk-taking and participation, and your people are much more happier. So they trust the company 47% more, and they have 34% more commitment and engagement with the company as well. So growth mindset is good because it helps you to innovate, it helps you to take risks and try new things, and have happier, more engaged employees. And I would say that distinction that I see between the two is very, very clear.
So the biggest obstacle is a fixed mindset. The biggest enabler is a growth mindset. And so the next question that arises, of course, is how can you cultivate a growth mindset in an organization that currently has a lot of fixed mindset going on? What are the actions, approaches, and tools that people can use to make sure that they get more of a growth mindset than of a fixed one? Because I guess there's a balance there. I feel like you can never completely eradicate fixed mindset because people will be coming in with baggage, maybe from other organizations, or be in a space in their life where it basically closes them off to opportunities to growth. And that's fine, but at least you want the scales to tip towards growth mindset. So how do we approach that? How do we nurture it?
Yeah, that's true what you say. It's a difficult thing, as is all culture change. It's a very difficult thing that requires consistency and long-term effort. There's 5 or 6 major things that you can do. And the first thing I would say is start with managers. So you need your managers to lead by example. And this is really important. What I observed in the companies with growth mindsets are that the managers tend to empower their teams the most. They give them the most permission to do new things, to try new things. And I would say that they are coaches and they teach their employees. So the very famous example is from 2014, Microsoft, Satya Nadella, which his position as the new CEO was to change the culture from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. And he made the distinction that within Microsoft, it wasn't the role of the manager and the employees to know everything and be first and have no mistakes, but rather to learn and develop new things and new skills as they go along. So that was a big cultural change there. And in terms of coaching and teaching your teams, that also means you have to change your mindset as a manager towards this growth mindset. Netflix do that very well. They have, a 360 tool, and they search for feedback, with an unceasing, relentless pace every day after every meeting, feedback, feedback, feedback. And that helps people grow, take new skills in a very safe way. It's never a personal attack. It's always to help you improve and help the company improve. So having that coaching and teaching role as a manager is really important. And then I also think when it comes to leadership and management, you need to lead by example and show that you don't have all of the answers. The role of a manager is not to know everything. Again, don't be a know-it-all, but actually admit your mistakes and make it safe to fail. Destigmatize the failure. And, I always like to say as a manager, when you listen, you are never short of new ideas. And that plays very well to innovation, because when you're a manager that knows everything and doesn't need the help of anyone and always has the answers, well, it just can't be a reality in the day of work that we live in now. So we need to change that mindset.
I want to jump in and have a quick question, if I may, acting as a proxy, I guess, for our listeners, because people might be listening to this and saying, yeah, sure, Dan, it sounds nice and I understand that I need to make it okay to fail. But the reality is we don't have the luxury to fail. I have my boss and he's or she is breathing down my neck. And basically, I know that if we mess up, the consequences are going to be pretty dire. And it's not even that they will tell me off or I will lose my job, but it's going to have a negative impact on our business. And if our business is not doing well, then people might lose their jobs and so on and so forth. So it snowballs out of control. So I do understand why people are a little bit hesitant and why sometimes it's hard for them to wrap their minds around what does it really mean to make it okay to fail. So can you speak to this, and how can you de-risk failure so that you nurture the mindset, but not at a cost of something that you cannot afford to lose?
This is, a really common question that every person, every company faces and has that challenge. And I would say the first thing is, when you make a mistake, is it really irreversible? Most things can be reversed at a click of a button. Most things can be put back to how it was before. And yes, you may need to apologize to your customers. You may need to do a remediation exercise, but the world really doesn't end. So you need to change the mindset around that. But I know that's hard. So the best companies are typically creating environments or spaces to experiment. The word here, failure, is not what I'm using. I'm using the word experiment because that's really the space and the encouragement that we need. We need to make sure that when we do things, we don't hide from the learnings. That's very important. And we share those learnings so we don't make the same mistakes from the experiments we've done. Again, and perhaps one of the best companies at this is Ben & Jerry's. All of the listeners will have eaten Ben & Jerry's ice cream.
I'm a big fan.
Yeah, me too. Their head office is in Vermont in the United States, and they have what is known as the flavor graveyard. And this is a physical graveyard of the flavors that they've launched to the market and that didn't sell well, and they had to retire the product. And the employees in the office can see that graveyard every day when they go to work, and they can understand that it is safe to experiment. It is safe to fail and learn and try things, and that's very important. Google, again, did this kind of safe to experiment with their 20% time. So they gave people an opportunity to work on new things, to innovate, to try things without the risk of failure, impacting customers, or having those bad consequences that you described. And I think it's all about creating those environments very intentionally and purposefully.
Yeah, I love that. Having that sandbox. By the way, I don't know if you know, Dan, my first startup was an ice cream factory. We started it with a friend of mine. Actually, he wanted to convince me to start it with him from the very, very first days. And I resisted, and then I joined him. And so I wish I knew of that back then, because I know from, personal experience, speaking of ice cream, how many attempts it takes to create a flavor that your consumers are going to love. And we messed up our culture really badly back then in that startup. And so I wish I knew that. I love this story. And now I use it actually in some of the keynotes that I give. to organizations about the importance of failures. And what a great example. And speaking of Google, and I wonder what your take on this is, because they were one of the pioneers of experimentation, allowing people to follow their passion and bringing more innovation into the company this way. And as I'm sure you've heard, they've started cutting back on that and focusing a lot on efficiency. So I wonder, what are your thoughts on that? How is that companies that we look up to, that we consider to be role models of innovation, seem to be going back on the good stuff that made them successful?
The key here is that the market is changing and companies have to change in response to the market. And hopefully before the market changes, they make these adjustments. And it's true what you say. Of course, across the tech industry, there are the mass layoffs now and big focus on efficiency. But one of the things that they're staying really, really consistent to is talent development and developing talent from within. And this really is another principle of how to have a growth mindset or encourage that growth mindset. I always like to say you should hire people from within your company because you're showing, or promote people from within your company because you're showing that there is a career pathway, that there are opportunities to try new things and to grow. And if you look at Microsoft, McKinsey, IBM, they do about 60% of their senior hires from within. Compare and contrast that to the United States Postal Service, that I think no one has a good opinion of, only doing 20% of their hiring from within. I think that's very important to show that you value growth and potential of employees and not the past positions that they've had on their CV. And Google is an interesting case study because here they actually hire people who have no college degrees. So they're not searching for people who have qualifications or experience. They're searching for people who have potential to develop and grow. So that's really interesting to me. Also, when you think about developing talent, one of the things the most successful companies are doing now is that they're encouraging what I call cross-domain learning. So they're heavily focused on job swaps, job shares, short-term assignments, talent marketplaces, all those kind of things, because people want to learn in the flow of work, learn as they go along. You know, British Telecom, talking about the UK, a fantastic company there, they actually asked their engineers to video themselves solving complex problems for customers, and they uploaded those videos to an intranet. And now when someone has the same difficult problem, they can go and see a video of an engineer doing it. Microsoft Viva, Salesforce, they all have wonderful integrations for people to learn in the flow of work. And it seems to me that this ability to grow and the potential we place upon people is more important than what does the CV say.
Yeah, I love it. And I love this aspect of building a community of practitioners within your organization. I'm obviously a big believer in communities of practice. We run our CultureBrained community for culture leaders. And I see this happening a lot actually in organizations, and especially large organizations, obviously, that have large communities of practice where people can learn from their peers and continue learning from their peers on the job every single day. So there's definitely something to leverage there. And your point about providing people with career development and career opportunities, I feel is so incredibly important because there's so much data now that points us in this direction. I mean, people say that the number one reason, we always thought that is a crappy manager, someone who's really toxic, but actually the number one reason, according to a lot of surveys, is the sense that people's talents and capabilities are not being utilized or developed in the current organization. And that's why they will move on. These are super useful tips. But I'm mindful also of the fact that I cut you off a little bit when you were talking about what else we can do to cultivate a growth mindset, because I wanted to double click on failure and how to approach it. So what other things can our listeners do or look at to make sure that they really nurture growth mindset in their company?
The one other thing that's really important is goal setting. So when people come into companies and they set their objectives for the year, for the month, for the quarter, whatever that might be, we've typically seen companies just set goals related to the business objectives. And that's been proven to not necessarily be the right thing to do. The better companies, or the most innovative companies, are actually encouraging personal growth and learning, and having their employees set that as a goal. So again, going back to the development of talent and hiring from within or promoting from within, letting people know that it's safe to grow and to try new things or learn new skills and have new experiences is very important. And when you set the goals aligned to the business, don't set easy goals. Set high and hard goals. And actually, there's a great research from Latham and Locke, two American professors, who proved that companies who set high and hard goals had between 11 and 25% improvement in their commercial performance. So setting those high and hard goals is very, very important because it gives people the permission to try difficult things. And if you fail, there's not necessarily a stigma attached to it because we already said this was a difficult thing to achieve. So you go that little bit further. And there's a great company called Gympass. I think they're based in the United States, but they're a global company. They're a startup started a few years ago. And they let people visit gyms across the world for one monthly subscription through an app. And what they do is they have what they call their North Star. So they have the direction that the company's going in. And as long as the employees propose a goal or a project or an objective that's aligned with that North Star, generally speaking, no one can say no to that project or goal or objective. And that's very important as well because it keeps people really honest. It keeps them very innovative. It means that as long as you're going in that direction, you're going to have the permission to continue. Of course, if you're going in the opposite direction of the North Star, then that's a different conversation. But I think giving people permission is really important.
Yeah. And one of the things that I'm curious about when you are setting up that kind of environment is what happens when, you have 100 people and each person has an idea of how to move in the right direction, how to move the needle in the right direction, but they are 100 different ideas. Do you know from your experience how companies deal with that? Because I can only imagine that if you create an environment that is very empowering and enabling, people will deliver and they will have a lot of great ideas. So then how do you prioritize? How do they prioritize? What is the way to deal with, I guess, a champagne problem of having too much initiative, too much innovation, and having somehow to prioritize, to be strategic?
Yeah, we always say champagne ideas with a Coca-Cola budget. That is a challenge. I guess the key is, and I think in the case of Gympass or in the case of Salesforce, who have a wonderful performance system called V2MOM, what they do there is they've really defined that North Star or that company purpose with a high degree of detail and accuracy. So it's very clear to people the direction. It's not expansive. It's not super broad reaching where you're going to have 100 different ideas in different directions. But of course, you need to prioritize along that journey should there be too many things, of course.
So you'll get those strategic pillars and then you basically invite people to think, how can we strengthen that specific pillar? But you do create constraints, which goes back to your earlier point about innovation actually requires constraints. If you give people a completely blank page or blank slate, it's an obstacle towards innovation. So it's better to have less resources or more constraints than complete freedom and like free cards, do anything, whatever you can think about.
Absolutely. And, one of the principles in my book is create creativity with constraints. That plays a lot to the Nokia example that I shared, where they're trying to outspend their rivals. But if you look at the companies that created an artificial constraint, so for example, if I take International Airlines Group, we all fly on Iberia planes or British Airways planes. They created Hangar 51, which is basically a startup incubator. And they give people 10 weeks only to come up with a business concept, an idea, a pilot. And at the end of the 10 weeks, a decision's made, whether that's rolled out across the company or within an airline. And that constraint of 10 weeks' time really creates that environment of pressure cooker. So it's really, really wonderful. And it's not only them doing it in that way. You have some of the pharmaceutical giants doing the same thing. You have Johnson & Johnson doing the same thing with few budgets, very few money. You can utilize internal resources, but nothing else. So always creating creativity with constraints is a good tactic, I would say, when it comes to innovation.
I love that. So finally, to wrap up this topic of growth mindset, I wonder if you could shed some light on the relationship between growth mindset and psychological safety. Because to me, in my mind, they are tightly related and you cannot have one without the other. You cannot have growth mindset without psychological safety. Do you agree with that? And if yes, what have you noticed about the best practices again in organizations that do it well?
I completely agree with that. I think, for example, in a growth mindset, you need to encourage speaking up, but you cannot speak up if you don't have safety within the organization, if you don't feel safe to do that. So the best organizations are focused on psychological safety, absolutely. And there's a few hints and tips that you can do to really foster or boost psychological safety. For example, you can have leaders setting very, very clearly the expectations and responsibilities of people. So if I tell everybody in the company, you should come up and try to experiment and come up with a new idea, then I've said very clearly, this is safe to do. If I do the reverse and I say, don't do that, no one will take any risk. So again, that's okay, but just make it clear to the employees and the people that you're partnering with. So setting those expectations is important. I think having courageous conversations is also important. So sharing something about you personally, sharing a time when you failed, sharing an experience that you have, that's really important because it builds connections within the workplace. It shows that you're only a human, a person as well. And also, I think one of the biggest mistakes that people fall into when building safety is that they try to rush to give advice. They always think that their job is to give the answer. And, I mentioned that leaders don't need to have the answers all of the time. When you listen to people, they generally bring the answers. And, I would tell the listeners here, please go and watch the first episode of New Amsterdam Hospital. This is a wonderful TV show. I would tell you that you can watch the first episode and it will take an hour of your day. You will probably then watch the next 5 series and waste your life. But the first episode is a masterclass in psychological safety. So you have a junior doctor, Max Goodwin, coming into a massive hospital in the US. Probably he's underqualified. But what he does is he gathers all of the staff in the auditorium on the first day. And he says, okay, I've come to listen to you and I've come to help you. He calls the staff meeting, everybody files in. And he opens the meeting by saying that his sister was born and died in the hospital. So he immediately has that honest, open relationship, sharing personal information. He then proceeds to fire. He sacks the cardiac department and he says, you guys were so focused on making money, but you should have been focused on looking after the patients instead. So he makes it very, very clear the expectation, which is the hospital is not here to make money. The hospital here is here to look after the patients first and foremost. And then he says, how can I help you? And he lets people come up with ideas. They want to remove the emergency waiting room. They want to bring fresh food and healthy food into the hospital. And he doesn't give the ideas. He doesn't give the solutions. He lets the people bring the solutions to him. So he does what I would say is a masterclass in psychological safety. And it is true, you need psychological safety to really foster a growth mindset, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that example. And indeed, I think that a lot of people might be now getting a lot of hours spent watching the series on Netflix. But if there are lessons to be learned, you can say to yourself, it's okay, it's a good investment. It's a good investment of time. I love it. Oh my gosh, this is such a good conversation. And I wish we had more time, but I know that we are coming to the end of our time together. So let us shift gears a little bit because there is one thing that I wanted to discuss with you, which is the current times and this incredible amount of anxiety that we see everywhere. It's incredibly hard for a lot of people right now at work to basically maintain their sanity because when you turn on the news, it's always bad news. We're talking about recession, there is war, there is climate change, and a million other things happening right now. There are layoffs happening. A lot of organizations are going through transformation, major change, etc., etc. So what I'm noticing is a lot of people struggling and a lot of people experiencing anxiety. And I'm curious, Dan, from your point of view, what do you see and what can be done about this? Because we cannot ignore it. I don't feel like we can say, it's okay, it's people's personal lives, how they experience life. We cannot do anything about it. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a really big problem because people are basically having anxiety, as you say, because there is inflation, because there is a war going on, because the job market is uncertain. And actually, stress is a response to a threat situation. And I think this is what people are facing because of all of these challenges and situations that are going on. And anxiety is their response to the stress and the threat situation. And I think it's really incumbent upon leaders and managers and people within companies to help and to support their teams through that process. Because, of course, things in people's personal lives impact their working lives as well. And there is stress and there is anxiety generated through work. So it's not just either or personal or work lives. And in terms of being a manager or a leader in a company, I think the first thing you need to do is probably label the anxiety or the stress that you have yourself and practice self-care. So that would be my first piece of advice, really, is understand what you're going through, practice self-care so that you can help your teams who are also going through that as well.
Yeah, it's this classical thing, put your oxygen mask on yourself first. And people know it, but we forget it. So it's such a great reminder that a stressed person cannot help stressed people. Usually they will make things worse. If we want to be of help, we need to take care of our own anxiety first. What a great point. What are the best practices that you have seen either from individual leaders, organizations in this space where they supported their wider population with something that really worked? Because what I do notice, and I have really ambivalent feelings about this, is this whole movement of, okay, let's give our people resilience training or whatever. We're going to put a lot of pressure on them, but at least we will teach them how to be resilient. And I feel like this is very superficial and very reactive, and I'm not entirely sure how much value there is in that. So have you noticed any practices that scale in organizations that can help with this?
I think there's that one strand which you mentioned, which is, what's the well-being program? What's the holistic program and offering that you have as a company? Is it that you're asking people and facilitating that they sleep well, that they eat well, that they do exercise, they practice mindfulness and those kind of things, which are obviously all great things that we should try to do day in, day out. But I think the companies that are really, really excelling are the ones who have great communicators, the ones who are really open and honest with this topic. So I think leaders who accept uncertainty and convey the message that, yes, this is a difficult moment, there is uncertainty, we don't know what the future looks like, but also set a vision for the company or for the team or for the people, are really, really making great headwinds in this space. Those who say, we don't know the future, but we're going to go in this direction and make those expectations really clear are the ones that are particularly impressing me at the moment.
Are there any examples that come to your mind when you think about a leader who was really able to show up in a moment of uncertainty and anxiety and show up in a way that was really powerful and that had a positive impact on the company?
I think there's one in particular that always comes to the front of my mind when I'm asked this question, and it's Arne Sorensen, who was the CEO of Marriott Hotel Group. And actually, you can look on YouTube and find this video, and it's titled something like Arne Sorensen COVID-19 Crisis. And basically,
We'll post a link in the show notes so that people
great.
can find it.
That would be wonderful, so people can click and find the video. And it's a 5 minutes video, and it's his response early into the COVID crisis about what's the state of Marriott Hotel Group and what are the next steps. And he does what I've described. He's accepted that there's uncertainty because of COVID, and he provides a vision of what the future might look like. And it's very interesting to analyze this 5-minute video because his voice shakes at many points during the recording. So he shows that he's vulnerable. He shows that he's, a human with weaknesses, with vulnerability. He also doesn't sugarcoat the situation. So he says COVID is the most severe challenge that we have faced as a company throughout our entire history, much greater than the world wars and the difficult things that we've experienced before. And when he's recording the video, it's clearly a very cheap video to produce. It's not your typical CEO video in a grand setting. He's done one take. He makes mistakes. As I said, his voice shakes, but he also does wording mistakes. And he's left the video like that because I think he's trying to be authentic. He's trying to share his view of the world and his experience that he's living in a very authentic way. And of course, he passed away with cancer a few years later. And actually, he references the fact that he's actually bald in the video and doesn't have hair as a result of his cancer treatment. So he's being very, very authentic and sharing personal information there with everyone, which again makes you very relatable as a leader. Of course, he talks about that, and he also recognizes personal differences as well. So he recognizes that within the hotel group, there are people that work in the head office and there are people that work on the front line, and there's differences in the roles and the experiences that they're having. So I just find this video really, really wonderful. They published it very fast in response to COVID. It's a masterclass in not only psychological safety, but also how to respond to stress and anxiety and how to lead your teams through that. So one I really, really encourage people to watch and learn from.
I remember this video very well because a large group of my relatives and friends work in hospitality. So I think we were watching this space really closely. And I do remember vividly crying as I was watching it because it was so powerful and because it was so vulnerable. And one of the comments that I had from everyone was exactly what you said, that they released it so fast. It was so important to address these issues early on. And it goes to your point about the importance of communication in those situations generally. People really need to hear from a leader. And I think what he role models so beautifully, I agree with you, is the fact that you will never be able probably to deliver such a message in a perfect way. There will never be a perfect timing to do it. So sooner is better than later. And authentic is better than polished sometimes in those situations. It can be hard for leaders because a lot of leaders want to be sleek and want to be perceived as very capable. So there's a great, I think, development probably challenge for everyone. How can you be more real and authentic with your teams, especially when you are not certain how things are going to work out? I love it. Thank you. And we'll post a link in the show notes. So shifting gears, Dan, I have a challenge for you. The final section of the show, we call it the rapid fire questions. And it's a series of 5 questions that I ask in rapid succession. And the challenge here is to answer all of them, so all 5, in under 2 minutes. Shall we try?
Let's try.
Okay, let's try. So as you know, probably at CultureBrained, we are on a mission. And the mission is to make work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging. What is your number one tip to bring more of a sense of belonging into the workplace?
To bring a sense of belonging into the workplace, I always like to have people working on things that are aligned to their interests, but also the company strategy. So people know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they're making an impact. And I think when they can see how they make the impact, they feel much more engaged and realize their place and position within a company is contributing to something greater.
What is a sign, or perhaps even signs in plural, that a company culture needs some work, or perhaps even a major overhaul?
The one or the biggest red flag that I see is that one voice has the power within a company. All decisions go through one person or one group of people, one process, and there's no participation from the rest of the organization. That's always the number one flag for me.
Tricky question now, I admit. What company do you admire for their culture and why?
Really hard question because I've been blessed to research some of the top companies in the world, but I would say Lego is probably my favorite company for culture right now because they are a classic story of reinventing themselves, reinventing their business, from the 1930s through to a difficult patch in the 1990s and early 2000s to what they are now. And it's really a masterclass in having a culture where the customer is important, the employees are important, feedback is given and received in such a great way, and they're constantly striving to do more and new things.
The Culture Advantage is definitely a book people should read, and so I recommend it. But I want to ask you, what other books would you recommend to our listeners? They can be books on leadership, on culture, but also maybe even novels or even Netflix series. You have already recommended one. What should people be consuming to learn how to cultivate thriving cultures?
My number one book is Dr. Carol Dweck's book, Mindset. It's so important. It's not necessarily a book about culture per se. It's a book about growth mindset and developing yourself. But I think that's just a critical element. So my number one recommendation, Carol Dweck, Mindset.
Fantastic. Final question. This show, as you know, is called the Culture Lab. We believe in experimentation, just like you do. And so the question is, what is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow and experiment with tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Some things they can do tomorrow. I would say learn something new, try something new. So, the hot thing of today is this Chat GPT AI chatbot. Go and have a play with that. And then encourage your team to do the same. So try and have new experiences, take on new learnings every day you can.
Love that. If people want to learn more about you, about your work, about your research, what would be the best online places to go to?
So my website, danielstrode.com, is kept up to date with my latest thoughts in a blog, but I love LinkedIn as well. So Dan Strode on LinkedIn is a great place to contact me, and I usually respond to most of the messages I get, albeit with a delay sometimes, but that's a wonderful social media for me.
Amazing. Okay. Well, thank you for that. We'll put all the links in the show notes. Thank you for being here. And also, I have to say, thank you for being a part of our community. I'm so thrilled that you've joined recently and that our members can have access to your brilliance and what you've learned about cultivating thriving cultures. But also, which is actually quite incredible, seeing your openness to learning yourself. You are a professor, you are someone who has written a book about culture, you are global head of people and culture function at a huge organization, and yet you are always seeking to learn something new and learn from others, which is admirable. So I just want to say chapeau to you, because you really are a role model of what a growth mindset could look like. Thank you for that. It's an inspiration for me.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to the whole community, because as you say, I learn from them, hopefully as much as they learn from me, but probably not. I learn much more from them, and I'm really grateful to everyone for participating and sharing as well.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
I'm Aga Bayer, the creator and host of the Culture Lab podcast, and this is the Culture Lab team.
Anis and Labarawi, production manager.
Sound producer, Heather McPherson, Twisted Spur Media.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. Dan and I hope that you get inspired by what we talked about and that you will have an opportunity to use at least some of his ideas to cultivate a culture of innovation in your company. We're also going to have Dan in a member spotlight session in the CultureBrained community. If you are a member already, you can RSVP on our private platform. If you are not a member yet, CultureBrained is a one-of-a-kind global community for culture leaders who look for new ways of cultivating remarkable cultures in this brave new world of remote and hybrid work. If you are in charge of a culture-shaping project, and if you believe that work should be synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, you'd probably feel right at home in our community. You can learn more at tinyurl.com/culturebrained. And don't worry, you don't need to write it down. You'll find the link in the show notes. And now, a quick preview of the upcoming episode. Now, this time, my guest is an amazing woman, Trier Bryant. Trier is the president of H2VS, which is Alloy Therapeutics affiliated venture studio. She's also the co-founder and CEO of the company called Just Work, which she co-founded with Kim Scott, who was one of our previous guests on the show and in the CultureBrained community as well. Just Work helps organizations and individuals to build more equitable workplaces. And this is predominantly what we talk about in the upcoming episode with Trier. Now, in this snippet, Trier explains the difference between bias, prejudice, and bullying. Tune in to hear the full interview with Trier really soon.
What's so powerful about the framework is that it's very tactical and practical for leaders, but also everyone in the organization, of things that we can do and how we can show up and language we can use to name the root causes of workplace injustice, which we define as bias, prejudice, and bullying. And the simple definitions that we use is bias is not meaning it. It's unconscious. Prejudice is meaning it, right? We double down on a harmful stereotype or belief. And then bullying is being mean with the intent to cause harm.
Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Culture Lab podcast. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share this episode with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared. If you haven't subscribed to the Culture Lab yet, you can do it on any podcast streaming platform of your choice. If you want to receive our weekly insights on cultivating a remarkable, powerful, and authentic company culture, especially in a business that scales, type this into your browser. tinyurl.com/agabayer. That's tinyurl.com/AGABAJER. Also, we would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to it. And finally, the entire Culture Lab team and our guests, we are going to continue exploring how we can make the word work synonymous with fun, meaning, and belonging, and how we can build remarkable cultures that scale as our businesses grow and the world keeps on changing. So, what do you want to hear about next? What matters to you? Email us at lindsay@agabayer.com and let us know.